Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your company's presentation. My name is Pablo Mitchell. I'm a member of church. I've been a member here since November of last year, so about a year. And I teach at Oberlin College. I teach history and Latino and Latina history, and history of American West, and a couple other topics at Oberlin College. So today what I wanted to do is go ahead and talk a little bit about Latino and Latina history, a couple aspects of it. First, I wanted to give a brief discussion of terminology, just various terms, Latino, Latina, Chicano, Chicana, Hispanic, and so on, and then move into an overview of some of those groups and the presence of some of those groups in the United States, and then talk a bit about sources and about doing research. You have in front of you, that's a court case from 1929 in Texas, and I'll be talking about that at the end, and if you have questions about that, go right ahead and let me know. Feel free during the presentation if you have questions to go ahead and raise your hand. I'd be happy to pause and try and address those questions. Again, what is Latino and Latina? I apologize for having to jump up here and do this. So, what is Latino and Latina? These are some of the various terms, and so I tend to consider Latino as of Latin American descent. That tends to be used in some ways interchangeably with Hispanic. Hispanic is a term that was more or less invented around 1970 by the U.S. government in terms for use in census documents, and so there has been a tension in some ways between the use of Latino as something that has more of kind of a grassroots feel to it, and something that Hispanic that tends to be then imposed from the top down. There is also, though, I think there's some good reasons to use Hispanic. Clearly, it then refers back to a Spanish heritage, and one of the important links between then people of Latino and Latina descent and ancestry is Spanish and is speaking Spanish. So there are some good reasons to use Hispanic. I tend to use Latino, and I also tend to use Latina, Latino to then emphasize then the presence of Latinas. In Spanish, then the O tends to kind of obscure. The O tends to be male, right? So Latino. And Latinos tends to describe men and women. So in some ways I think of it as analogous as saying, you know, mankind. And so trying to move away to an extent from that. And it's also, for me, also helpful to kind of have my tongue continue to kind of say Latina, Latina, so that to remind me of the presence of women and Latinas. Okay, there are various then groups within Latino and Latina history. One of the most prominent is Chicanos and Chicanas. These are folks of Mexican origin. Also Mexican American is another term folks will use. Chicano and Chicana tended to then emerge in the 1960s in some ways as a response, as a political response to subordination among a group of younger activists. So they would kind of recover the term Chicano and Chicana, which had been a derogatory term. So Chicano had been a derogatory term among Mexican communities previous to the 1960s. I think you can think an analogy in some ways as the kind of recovery of black among the African American freedom struggle. So a movement away from Negro towards black, and I think you can see some of those tensions coming up in terms of Chicano and Chicana, and it has a politicized identity. There are various then terms that refer to different regions. So Hispano and Hispanic tends to refer to New Mexicans, Nuevo Mexicanos, Tejanos, Californios, and so on. So at various points, folks' identity will be much more linked to their region. People will talk about themselves as Tejanas than necessarily as Chicanos or Chicanas or Latinos and Latinas. So, then of course Puerto Rican, Dominican American, Central American, Cuban American, some of the major groups, and I'll be talking about those groups so far. Are there questions about the terminology?
Well, what does that shift mean in Chicano? Is there an English translation?
You mean the CH?
CHIC, Chick.
Yeah, you know, folks have kind of tried to trace that back. Originally, so it had been a term of a kind of derogatory term as kind of, you know, working class and so on. Folks would look back to Mexica and to Mexico and kind of try to trace in some ways the roots back to kind of an indigenous past. So then Aztlán and so on. So the Mexica would then kind of come in would come from that, from Mexico, and so from indigenous past. So part of that, and I think it's helpful to point that out, is within the Chicano and Chicana movement in the 1960s, there was a real attempt to recover then a sense of an indigenous past and a sense of the American Southwest as being a homeland of Mexican people. So there was an argument that Aztlán, the kind of name of the homeland, was a place where Aztecs migrated from when they moved into Mexico City, moved south from Mexico City. So many of the battles during the Chicano movement were about land and recovering land and making claims on the Mexicans' ability to kind of claim that land. Okay, so let me move into some of the various groups, and then we'll talk about Chicanos. First, I wanted to just point out some numbers here, point out kind of the growth of the Hispanic, again, within the kind of the U.S. government data. This is the population in millions, 100 million projected by 2050. Percent Hispanic of the total population, nearly a quarter of the population by 2050. These, again, are projections. This is the 2006 numbers. So some of the states with the highest then Latino and Latina population: California, clearly, Texas, Florida, especially augmented by Cuban American then immigration, as well as Puerto Rican and Dominican and Central American and Florida as well, in Miami. New York City, larger kind of the main site of Puerto Rican migration during the early part of the 20th century, and Illinois, largely Chicago then too, so both Puerto Rican and Mexican in various groups. Give you kind of a sense then of the large percentage then of Latino peoples in the Southwest, the American Southwest. The major percentage, and I'll talk about, of Latino population is Mexican. So we can look at Mexican then. In 2006, nearly 2/3 of the Latino and Latina population in the country is of Mexican origin. So either Mexican immigrants or then U.S. born of Mexican descent. Pass along these numbers. So I wanted to go back, and this is one thing I tell my students when I teach Latino and Latina history. Part of the argument, and part of what I'll be talking about today, are the long roots then of people of Latin American descent in the United States. And just to give a bit of the context then for this. So St. Augustine, Florida, Spanish 1565, Santa Fe, New Mexico, 1610, Jamestown, right, in Virginia, the English founding, Quebec, French. So let me start with Chicano history. This, coming over here, if you can see that small, is the route of the Cabeza de Vaca expedition that I'll be talking about. So this has various shipwrecks and stories of cannibalism among the Spanish and so on, and finally winding its way back down to Mexico City. The Coronado expedition moves up this way and eventually it moves into Kansas. Again, this is the early part of the first half of the 16th century, well before, right, Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock and so on. So, the Spanish then settled largely in New Mexico in the 16th century and the 17th century, spreading in the 18th century into Texas and into California. Much of what is now the Southwest, and many of the large percentage of the Mexican population in the Southwest became part of the United States after the Mexican-American War in 1848 and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So the Mexican-American War starts in spring of 1846, is then completed by 1848. So it gives up California, New Mexico, parts of present-day Arizona, Colorado, and so on. There's also a pledge within this treaty to respect the rights of all Mexicans who remain in the United States. And it is also within this treaty that Mexicans who remain within the United States will be allowed to become citizens of the United States and will become citizens of the United States. And so this sense of citizenship, American citizenship for Mexicans, becomes then a crucial point among Chicano and Chicana activists. The second half of the 19th century, then the second half of the 1800s, is marked by increasing political marginalization of Mexicans, increasing economic marginalization of Mexicans. By 1900, there are about 300,000 Mexicans in the American Southwest. So we start to see then maybe 5% of the population in Texas, 5% of the population in California, a bit more in New Mexico, but not having much political power or economic power. (1900) marks an important transition point then in Mexican population into the United States. California, in Texas. Some railroad construction as well. You see increasing then railroad construction. These are all jobs, so there are available jobs. This coincides then with an increasing anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States during this period, so increasing anti-immigrant restrictions. Both of these then open up possibilities for Mexicans to get jobs. So there are increasingly restrictions placed on Asians coming to the United States, Chinese exclusion law, Japanese restriction. Increasingly, there are also restrictions placed on Europeans coming to the United States by 1924. So all of this then cuts off available job supply there are no restrictions placed on movement from people in the Americas, coming from South or Central America. So the agribusiness lobby is very successful actually in keeping those restrictions out, because they're looking for then, to an extent, exploitable labor. So during this period then, Mexican immigrants become the backbone of the American economy in the Southwest, become then largely the backbone of the agribusiness, largely the backbone of railroad construction and so on. And you see the numbers then of Mexican people starting to rise dramatically during the 19-teens and 1920s. In addition, there was immigration, historians will talk about push factors. So you see increasing in political turmoil in Mexico. So the Mexican Revolution explodes in 1910. You have also economic destabilization, large levels of poverty in Mexico itself. So you see then a coming together of a drawing forces for jobs, pull factors, more jobs available in the Southwest, and push factors pushing people out of Mexico, political instability, widespread political violence, and poverty and economic problems in Mexico. All this leads to increasing then Mexican immigration.
I'm curious, are you advocating, I'm not sure, open borders, or should we accept more of immigrants?
No, I'm not really advocating either one of those so far in the presentation. I'm just kind of giving you a sense of just some
because
of
I'm looking at the ultimate. I mean, do we increase our immigration from all over the world?
Right.
And I'm thinking of more, say, third world.
Right.
Would love to come here.
Yeah. Some. I mean, I think.
Yeah.
Why don't we wait until the presentation's over and then we can get to those issues? So yeah. I think it's good to point out that issues of immigration and issues of tensions between those advocating immigrant, high levels of immigration, and those against it have been in tension for a long time in the country, right? And especially around Latino and Latina peoples. With the advent of the Great Depression, the stock market crash in 1929, then there's a turning against then this Mexican population. So there's increasing anti-immigrant sentiment targeting Mexicans, and this leads to where we have become known as the repatriation campaigns. And so I have those there from 1929 more or less to 1935. These are local level.
A question. With the original Great Depression, are we seeing roughly the same thing happening again with the Great Recession?
I'm not sure if we are. I mean, I think one of the points I'd like to kind of make is that ordinary Mexicans have been very strong advocates and defenders of their citizenship rights, and so have been very, I think, canny at being able to reach out to a variety of then support systems.
But what I'm saying is the North Americans, are they looking, I mean, with like, what's it, Alabama?
Right.
Anybody who's a legal alien now, they're all moving to Florida.
Right. I think there is a bit of scapegoating. I think this was clearly a period of scapegoating against Mexicans. I don't know if it's, the argument that they're taking American jobs, I think was much more vibrant and much more kind of possible in the 1930s than it would be now. I think that there have been generations then of Anglo-Americans who have not wanted to do farm work. And so the argument that, well, they're taking all these jobs that, white Americans could have, I don't know if that's really flying quite, if that's quite as effective an argument. And maybe I'm wrong, but.
NPR just had a major section on this of what happened in Alabama. And what they were really saying is that people who are actually doing the crop are very skilled workers. They know how to work efficiently, and they're physically fit and can do it. And when you try and put somebody who's never tried it, they last one day and don't come back.
Yeah, that's a great point about kind of skilled workers, and I think there's this idea that you can just step in and actually know which thing to, in a sugar beet or something like that, which leaf to cut off and which one to leave. And so I think that's a great point about skilled workers.
And in Alabama, they were talking about one of the tomato growers realizing that if he had to use the American workers who were unskilled, it cost $7 a pound instead of $1 a pound.
Right, absolutely. No,
and he's competing with other states. So
right, absolutely.
Serves him right.
Yeah. Those who managed then, estimates are that in the repatriation campaigns that hundreds of thousands of Mexicans either were kind of coerced or were kind of encouraged to leave and go to Mexico and leave the United States. Those who managed to stay built then vibrant communities, and I think we can see some around here, that in Lorain, Ohio, we have the roots of this community, the Mexican community in Lorain. It goes back to the 1920s, and those were folks who managed to stay during these repatriation campaigns. I want to highlight one more thing, and that's the Bracero program. During World War II, there was an argument among agriculture and among agribusiness that there was a shortage of harvesters, shortage of farm workers, because everyone, of course, is often in the war. So they start to form an agreement with then Mexico to import then contract workers. This was, in a large ways, a great fiasco for Mexicans, and there were large levels of exploitation of workers during this period. One thing I wanted to point out is that this kind of, every now and again you hear then contract labor as being kind of, well, this is a way to solve our problem, our immigration problem, and I think it's important to look back at the Bracero program as being a place of great abuses. The Mexican government at a certain point said they're not going to send any of their citizens, any of their workers into Texas at all, and so cut off Texas completely from this contract because of the abuses. So I think contract labor, I think, is often seen as kind of a panacea. That's how we'll get around this problem. But the Bracero program is a good example of how difficult it is to make this equitable for the workers.